The lonely wail of a harmonica drifted across the open plains like a ghost searching for home, stopping abruptly when the letter arrived in Hank O'Malley's calloused hands. It was 1878, and the 30-year-old rancher stared at the delicate handwriting that would change everything. Arriving on Tuesday's train, yours truly, Rose Jennings. Hank folded the letter and tucked it into his shirt pocket close to his heart, though he'd deny such sentimentality if asked. 3 months had passed since he'd placed the advertisement in the Eastern newspaper. Hard-working rancher seeks practical woman for marriage, comfortable home provided, must tolerate solitude and Wyoming winters. What he hadn't mentioned was the suffocating silence of the prairie that threatened to swallow him whole since his parents had passed 4 years prior. The Rocking O Ranch outside Laramie was prosperous but desperately empty. At night, when the cattle quieted and the wind died down, Hank would sometimes pull out his harmonica, the only companion that understood his loneliness. Tuesday arrived with uncommon speed. Hank stood on the train platform, hat in hand, boots polished and beard trimmed. The locomotive thundered into the station, belching steam and cinders, carrying his future bride from Philadelphia. His stomach knotted as passengers disembarked. Would she be disappointed? Would she turn around and board the next train east when she saw the harsh reality of ranch life? She stepped down from the third car, and Hank's breath caught. Rose Jennings was petite with chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest blue bonnet. She wore a traveling dress that had seen better days and carried a small trunk in one hand and, curiously, a violin case in the other. "Mr. O'Malley?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite the 14-day journey. "Miss Jennings." Hank nodded, reaching for her trunk. "Welcome to Wyoming territory." Rose surveyed the dusty street, wooden storefronts, and distant mountains with searching eyes. "It's more beautiful than I imagined." Hank's eyebrows rose. Most Easterners saw only the desolation. "The ranch is about an hour's ride. I've brought the wagon." On the journey to the Rocking O, Hank stole glances at his mail-order bride, 24 years old according to her letters. Her face bore the weariness of travel but couldn't hide a certain determination in her jawline. She clutched the violin case protectively in her lap. "You play?" he asked, breaking the awkward silence, "since I was a girl." Her fingers traced the worn case. "My father taught me." Hank nodded, understanding her attachment to the instrument. "And your family? They were agreeable to you coming west?" Her expression clouded. "My parents passed in the influenza outbreak 2 years ago. I was working as a seamstress in my cousin's shop, but—" She straightened her shoulders. "I wanted more than a life of mending other people's dreams." The wagon crested a hill, revealing the Rocking O spread below a sturdy 2-story house. Barn, corral, and outbuildings nestled in a valley with grazing cattle dotting the distance. "There it is," Hank said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "Not fancy, but it's mine. 400 acres, 200 head of cattle, and room to grow." Rose's eyes widened. "It's magnificent." For the first time since her arrival, Hank felt a glimmer of hope. The house was clean but austere, a bachelor's domain where function trumped comfort. Rose moved through the rooms, touching the wooden furniture, peering out windows, taking inventory of her new home. "My mother's things are in trunks in the attic," Hank explained. "Never had the heart to decide what to do with them. You're welcome to use whatever you like." Rose nodded, her gaze lingering on the empty walls, the absence of curtains, the utilitarian kitchen. "Thank you, I'd like that." That evening, after a simple meal of beef stew that Hank had prepared, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, 2 strangers bound by a contract neither fully understood. "We should discuss arrangements," Hank said, clearing his throat. "The preacher comes through once a month." "He'll be here next Sunday." Rose's cheeks flushed. "For the wedding," Hank nodded, "if that suits you. Until then, you'll take my parents' room. I'll sleep in the bunkhouse." Relief crossed her features. "That's very considerate." "I may not know much about being a proper husband, Miss Jennings, but I aim to be honorable." "I appreciate that, Mr. O'Malley." Hank stood, awkward in his own kitchen. I rise at dawn. The days start early here, I understand. Rose gathered her shawl around her shoulders. Good night, then. Good night, Miss Jennings. After she retired, Hank sat on the porch, harmonica in hand, but couldn't bring himself to play. The old tune that had kept him company for years suddenly felt insufficient with Rose Jennings sleeping under his roof. Morning revealed Rose's resilience. She was awake before him, hair neatly braided, sleeves rolled up, attempting to coax the temperamental cookstove to life. Coal goes in the bottom chamber, Hank explained, demonstrating. She's finicky in damp weather. Rose watched intently. Thank you, I'll learn, and learn she did. Within days, Rose tackled each domestic challenge with quiet determination, conquering the moody stove, discovering which floorboards creaked, locating the best spot for bread to rise. Hank found himself watching her from the corner of his eye as she moved through his house, her presence both foreign and increasingly necessary, like rain after drought. On the third evening, Hank returned from checking fence lines to find curtains hanging in the kitchen window, simple affairs made from an old tablecloth Rose had discovered in a trunk. Hope you don't mind, she said, noting his surprised expression. The afternoon sun was fierce. No, it's... Hank struggled to explain how the small change transformed the Stark room into something warmer. It's nice. That night, as darkness settled over the ranch and the coyotes began their distant chorus, Hank heard it, the gentle, haunting sound of a violin drifting from the house. He remained in the bunkhouse, listening as Rose played a melody that seemed to give voice to the vast Wyoming sky. The music called to something within him that had long been silent. Morning chores created a rhythm between them, Hank tending to the cattle and outer buildings while Rose managed the house and garden. They moved in orbits that occasionally intersected at meals, where conversation gradually became less stilted. Were you born here? Rose asked on the fifth day, serving him a slice of apple pie that rivaled his mother's. Born and raised. My father claimed this land during the Homestead Act, built everything you see with his own hands. You must be proud to carry on his work. Hank nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to swallow. What about your people? You mentioned Philadelphia, but where were you raised? Rose's fingers traced the edge of her plate. We lived outside Boston originally. My father was a music teacher at a girls' academy. Mother taught literature. We moved to Philadelphia after father's lungs weakened. And the violin, a small smile touched Rose's lips. Father insisted I learn, said music was the purest language of the soul. When illness kept him bedridden, I would play for him by the hour. Hank thought of his own harmonica, the simple instrument his father had carved and given him on his 10th birthday. My pa played, nothing fancy, just old folk tunes, but he could make that harmonica talk. Is that why you play? Hank's head jerked up. You heard me. The first night I arrived before the train, it was beautiful. Heat crept up Hank's neck. Just passing time. Rose seemed to understand his discomfort and changed the subject. I found your mother's seed packets in the pantry. Would it be all right if I planted some flowers? Just around the front porch. Suit yourself, Hank replied, though the thought of flowers blooming where only dust had gathered for years stirred something unexpected within him. Sunday approached with startling speed. The night before the preacher's arrival, Hank found Rose on the porch, violin tucked beneath her chin, playing to the sunset. He hesitated in the shadow of the barn, not wanting to interrupt. The melody was unfamiliar but undeniably hopeful, rising and falling like the rolling hills surrounding the ranch. Hank closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. When the final note faded, he approached. That was lovely, he said, climbing the porch steps. I don't recognize the tune. Rose lowered the instrument. It's something I've been composing, this land. It inspires me. Hank leaned against the railing. Miss Jennings, Rose, tomorrow the preacher comes. Yes. Her fingers tightened around the violin's neck. If you've changed your mind about our arrangement, I'd understand. Town's growing. You could find work as a music teacher, perhaps, or return east. Rose studied him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. Are you having second thoughts, Mr. O'Malley? Hank, he corrected gently. And no, but I want you to be certain, marriage out here isn't easy, winters are brutal, nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, town's half a day's ride. I didn't come 3,000 miles seeking easy, Rose replied, her voice steady. I came seeking purpose, a place to belong. Their eyes held for a long moment before Hank nodded. Then I'll see you tomorrow at noon. The wedding was a simple affair, just Hank, Rose, Preacher Davis, and the Wilsons from the neighboring ranch as witnesses. Rose wore a cream-colored dress she'd altered from one of Hank's mother's gowns. Hank donned his Sunday shirt, freshly pressed. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes, but when Hank slipped his mother's gold band onto Rose's finger, he felt the weight of generations past and future bearing witness. They sealed their vows with a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless left Hank's heart hammering like a wild horse against a stall door. Mrs. Wilson had prepared a small feast, and the afternoon passed pleasantly with food and conversation. As the sun began its descent, their guests departed, leaving the newlyweds suddenly, awkwardly, alone. I should check on the north pasture before dark, Hank said, reaching for his hat. Rose touched his arm. Hank, we should talk about arrangements, he stilled, understanding her meaning. There's no rush, Rose. We have time to get acquainted proper. Gratitude flickered in her eyes. Thank you. That night they shared the main bedroom, an appropriate distance maintained between them in the large feather bed. Hank lay awake, acutely conscious of Rose's breathing, the faint lavender scent that clung to her hair, the strangeness of another person occupying his solitude. Dawn broke with a violent thunderstorm that kept them housebound. While Hank repaired tack in the front room, Rose baked bread, the homey aroma filling the house. Between thunderclaps, Hank noticed her humming melodies he couldn't place. Would you play something? He asked suddenly. Rose looked up, surprised. Now, if you'd like, seems a good day for music. She retrieved her violin, and soon the mournful strains of Shenandoah filled the room, competing with the pounding rain. Hank's fingers itched toward his pocket where the harmonica rested, but something held him back. As weeks passed, Rose transformed the ranch house. Curtains appeared in every window. Wildflowers brightened the kitchen table. She unearthed Hank's mother's quilts from cedar chests and hung them on walls that had stood bare for years. Most significantly, music became a constant presence. Rose played in the evenings while Hank sat on the porch, smoking his pipe. Sometimes she performed familiar hymns and folk tunes. Other times, her own compositions filled the air, evoking the sweep of prairie grasses and distant mountains. Gradually, their marriage found its rhythm. Rose took over the household accounts, displaying a head for figures that impressed Hank. She started a vegetable garden, preserved summer's bounty for winter, and even learned to shoot the old Winchester repeater when coyotes threatened their chickens. One hot August afternoon, Hank returned from town to find Rose in the shade of the cottonwood tree, playing her violin for an audience of curious calves who had gathered at the fence. The sight this refined Easterner serenading his livestock made him laugh aloud. Rose looked up, smiling. They're very appreciative listeners. More than old Peterson at the general store, Hank replied, dismounting. Man could complain about gold being too heavy. He carried a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Got something for you. Rose set aside her violin, curiosity brightening her features. What's the occasion? Do I need one? Hank placed the package in her hands. Open it. Inside was sheet music, not the simple hymnal kind available locally, but proper classical scores he'd special ordered from Denver. Bach, Beethoven, and some Italian fellow whose name I can't pronounce, Hank explained, suddenly worried he'd presumed too much. Storekeeper said they're proper violin pieces. Rose traced the notes with reverent fingers, tears welling in her eyes. Vivaldi, she whispered. 4 Seasons. My father's favorite. Before Hank could respond, Rose stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to their first real kiss since the wedding. It lasted only a moment, but when she pulled away, something fundamental had shifted between them. That night, they came together as husband and wife for the first time, their union as natural as the meeting of earth and sky on the horizon. Afterward, Rose lay with her head on Hank's chest, his heartbeat a steady rhythm beneath her ear. "Play for me," she murmured. "What? Your harmonica?" "I've not heard you play since that day at the train station." Hank hesitated. "I'm not skilled like you." "Music isn't about skill," Rose said, echoing her father's words. "It's about what lives in your heart." Reluctantly, Hank reached for the harmonica on the bedside table. The first notes were hesitant, rusty from disuse, but gradually gained confidence an old cowboy ballad his father had taught him about finding home on the range. Rose closed her eyes, listening. When he finished, she whispered, "Beautiful." Autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold. The cattle were fat from summer grasses, and the ranch's ledgers showed a promising profit. Rose's garden had yielded bountifully, the root cellar now stocked with potatoes, onions, and apples. One evening, as the first frost threatened, Rose suggested something unexpected. "We should have a gathering," she said as they finished supper. "Invite the neighbors before winter sets in." Hank's brow furrowed. "A gathering, a harvest celebration with music and dancing." Enthusiasm brightened her voice. "The Wilsons, the Petersons from town, maybe even those new settlers by the creek." Hank hadn't hosted guests since his parents' funeral. The thought made him uneasy. "Ranch folk are busy this time of year." "Which is precisely why they need merriment," Rose countered. "Just one evening, Hank." "Before we're all snowbound." He couldn't deny her when she looked at him with such hope. "All right, but don't expect much socializing from me." Rose's delight was worth his discomfort. She spent days preparing baking pies, cleaning every corner of the house, arranging hay bales in the barn for seeding. To Hank's surprise, every invited family accepted. On the appointed evening, lanterns illuminated the barnyard. Neighbors arrived bearing additional food and drink. Mrs. Wilson brought her son who played the fiddle. Old Peterson revealed a talent for the banjo, and even shy Mrs. Jenkins from the mercantile sang beautifully. Rose was radiant, moving among their guests, her violin transitioning seamlessly between lively reels and poignant ballads. Hank watched from the shadows, amazed at how she'd breathed life into his isolated existence. "She's a remarkable woman, your wife," Mr. Wilson said, appearing beside him with 2 glasses of cider. "Never seen the rocking so vibrant." Hank accepted the drink. "She's changed everything." "For the better, I'd say." Wilson nodded toward the makeshift dance floor where Rose was teaching Mrs. Peterson's daughters a Virginia reel. "You struck gold with that mail-order bride." Later, when most guests had departed and only the embers of the bonfire remained, Rose found Hank by the corral. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her arms around his waist. "It meant everything to me." Hank pulled her closer. "Seeing you tonight, you belong here, Rose, not just on the ranch but with these people. You've created community where I only saw isolation." "Music brings people together," she replied. "Always has." That night, Rose confided her dream teaching music to the children scattered across neighboring ranches, perhaps eventually establishing a small school in town. Hank listened, realizing how narrow his vision had been, focused only on cattle and survival. "You should do it," he said. "This winter, when things slow down, we'll figure out how to make it happen." As predicted, winter descended with icy ferocity, blanketing the prairie in snow and confining them largely to the house. Yet unlike previous winters of solitary endurance, this one brought unexpected joy. They established evening rituals, Rose reading aloud from Dickens or Twain while Hank carved small wooden figures, followed by music before bed. Sometimes they played separately, Rose with her violin, Hank with his harmonica. Increasingly, though, they played together, creating harmonies that warmed the house more effectively than the wood stove. Word spread about Rose's musical talent. Families began bringing their children to the rocking-o once weekly for lessons, payment offered in butter, eggs, or mending services. Rose accepted all with grace, delighting in each child's progress. Christmas approached, their first as a couple. Rose decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons, insisting they observe proper traditions. Hank surprised her with a polished wooden music stand he'd crafted in secret. "It's exquisite," Rose marveled, running her fingers over the smooth oak. "When did you find time?" "Those afternoons you thought I was mending fence," Hank admitted. "Wilson's boy helped with the carving." Rose's gift to him was equally thoughtful, a hand-bound book of sheet music she'd transcribed for harmonica, including duets they could play together. "I've never had much use for Christmas before," Hank confessed that night as they lay entwined beneath quilts, watching snow fall outside their window. "Always seemed like an obligation." Rose propped herself on one elbow. "And now I understand why people celebrate beginnings." He traced her cheek with calloused fingers. "You've given me a new life, Rose. We've built it together," she corrected gently. "Like a duet." January brought a devastating blizzard that tested the ranch's resources. For 3 days, Hank battled howling winds to reach the cattle, returning each evening exhausted and frost-bitten. Rose maintained the household fires, tended the indoor animals, and played her violin to drown out the storm's wrath. When the blizzard finally relented, they discovered they'd lost only 5 head of cattle, a miracle compared to neighboring ranches. Rose insisted it was the music that had protected them. "The cows heard you're playing all the way in the south pasture," Hank teased, though privately he wondered if there wasn't some truth to her belief. February brought unexpected news. Rose missed her monthly courses, and though she hesitated to hope too fervently, the persistent morning sickness confirmed their suspicions. "A baby," Hank said, the word foreign on his tongue. "By harvest time." Rose placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "A new voice for our duet." The prospect of fatherhood awakened something primal in Hank. He threw himself into preparations, expanding the house with a nursery addition, crafting a cradle from pine harvested from their land, planning pasture improvements to increase the herd's value. Rose blossomed with pregnancy. Her music evolved too, incorporating lullabies and children's songs. She continued teaching, though she limited lessons to the ranch as her condition advanced. Spring's arrival triggered a frenzy of activity. While Rose planted an expanded garden, Hank hired 2 young cowboys to help with branding and moving cattle to summer pastures. The extra hands freed him to spend evenings with Rose, planning for their child's future. One sultry June evening, as fireflies danced beyond the porch and cicadas provided percussion, Rose placed Hank's harmonica in his hands. "Play for the baby," she urged, guiding his hand to her rounded belly. "Let our child know its father's voice." Hank hesitated, then began a gentle melody, "All the Pretty Little Horses," his mother's favorite lullaby. Rose closed her eyes, swaying slightly. Halfway through the song, she gasped. "The baby kicked. Right when you hit that high note," Hank froze. "Really? Keep playing," Rose encouraged. He continued, and sure enough, whenever the melody rose or fell dramatically, the baby responded with movement. Hank played until his lips grew numb, marveling at this tiny critic. "Our child has excellent taste," Rose laughed, placing her hands over Hank's, "and knows its father already." Summer progressed with merciful gentleness, adequate rain, moderate temperatures, and healthy cattle. Rose's due date approached as harvest neared. They hired Mrs. Wilson to help with the birth, and the midwife took up residence in the spare room 2 weeks before Rose's time. The baby, however, had other plans. Labor began during a September thunderstorm while Hank was securing the livestock. By the time he returned, drenched and frantic, Rose was already deep in the throes of childbirth. For 16 hours, Hank paced outside the bedroom door, each of Rose's cries slicing through him like a knife. Mrs. Wilson periodically emerged with updates, her expression increasingly concerned as labor progressed. "The baby's turned wrong," she finally admitted. "I'm doing what I can, but—" "I'll ride for the doctor," Hank said immediately. Mrs. Wilson shook her head. Town's 6 hours round trip in good weather. With this storm and the creek rising, you'd never make it back in time. Desperation clawed at Hank's throat. Then what do we do, pray, the midwife said simply. And be ready when I call you. Hank slumped against the wall, helplessness overwhelming him. From inside the bedroom came another of Rose's cries, weaker than before. Almost without conscious thought, Hank reached for his harmonica. The first notes were shaky, but gradually steadied into amazing grace, the hymn his mother had sung during difficult times. He played through his repertoire folk songs, lullabies, even attempting some of the classical pieces Rose loved. Hour after hour, he maintained the musical vigil, pouring every ounce of hope and love into the simple instrument. Near dawn, the storm broke, and in the sudden quiet, a new sound emerged, the indignant wail of a newborn. Moments later, Mrs. Wilson opened the door, her exhausted face wreathed in smiles. You have a daughter, Mr. O'Malley, small but mighty in her lungs. Hank stumbled into the bedroom where Rose lay pale against the pillows, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. Hannah, Rose whispered as Hank approached. After your mother. Hank couldn't speak. His daughter's face was impossibly small, perfect, with Rose's delicate features and a wisp of dark hair. When he touched her cheek, she turned toward his finger, eyes blinking open. She knows your touch, Rose said, and your music. It guided her into the world. Tears streaked Hank's weathered face. I thought I'd lose you both. Music sustained us, Rose replied, her voice weak but determined, just as it brought us together. As autumn painted the Rockingham in golden hues, life settled into a new pattern. Hannah grew stronger daily, her personality emerging calm when Rose played violin, animated when Hank's harmonica filled the room. Word spread about Rose's music school, drawing students from as far as Cheyenne. Hank built a small classroom addition to accommodate the growing numbers. Rose taught 3 days weekly, balancing motherhood with her passion for music. The ranch prospered as well. With Rose managing the books and negotiating cattle contracts, profits increased substantially. They hired a permanent ranch hand, expanding operations into neighboring land that came up for sale. 1 year after Hannah's birth, the Rockingham hosted another harvest celebration, now an annual tradition eagerly anticipated by neighboring families. The gathering had grown to include nearly 40 people, with music and dancing lasting well into the night. As twilight descended and lanterns illuminated the barnyard, Hank and Rose stood on the porch, watching their guests. Hannah slept peacefully in Hank's arms, her tiny hand clutching his shirt. Remember when you arrived? Hank asked. When I warned you about the silence of this place, Rose nodded, leaning against his shoulder. It wasn't silent at all. The music was already here in the wind, the cattle, the creek. It just needed someone to give it voice. You gave me back my voice, Hank said, in more ways than one. From the barn came the sound of fiddles and banjos striking up a lively reel. Hannah stirred, her eyes opening at the music. Shall we join them? Rose asked, taking the baby. Our daughter should dance under the stars at least once tonight. As they walked toward the celebration, Hank marveled at how completely his life had transformed. 3 years ago, he'd been a solitary rancher existing in the margins of his own life. Now, music and laughter filled every corner of the Rockingham. The mail-order bride advertisement, written in desperate loneliness, had brought him not just a wife but a symphony where once there had been only silence. Together, they had composed something beautiful on the vast canvas of the Wyoming prairie. A love story set to music that would resonate for generations to come.